to meet the goals that are being were set in Paris and that are being enhanced here in Glasgow. And I think that's maybe the next big responsibility that we have as institutions.
Yes. No, it's good to remember that our building block 3 in the MDB 6 building blocks is about accelerating the transition through climate finance. So it's not just about counting it and tracking it, it's also about mobilizing more private finance, helping clients accelerate their project pipeline, etc. So it's more proactive than just a methodology for tracking. So Alhamdu, the last question to you. What's your forward looking? What do you think is the next big step?
For me, next steps include maybe three key elements. First, we need to operationalize the Paris Alignment Framework. It is already designed. We have few methodologies in place. We have been testing those methodologies. Now it's time to really speed up the implementation of the 6 building blocks. And for us, one particular building block is important, the building block number 4. Because, as I said, having just 2 African countries out of 54 developing their long-term strategy is not good enough. We need, and that's why we hope that the facility on LTS is going to help moving us in the right direction. I expect this facility will be established. And the second aspect is the building block number 3, finance, as you said. Look, Africa, for instance, has only access to 3% of the global climate finance, 20 billion last year, out of the 632 billion for climate finance last year. And out of the 20 billion that Africa received, 2 billion were mobilized domestically. So it leaves you with only 18 billion. So for us to respond to that challenge, we are coming up with new instruments, like the Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program that we have just launched yesterday. And we are rallying a campaign to mobilize resources for that initiative because it is a transformative program to accelerate adaptation action in Africa. We are also piloting other innovative instruments like the adaptation benefit mechanism in order to put value on adaptation and resilience. Because so far, a private sector is afraid in investing in adaptation. How can you make a strong business case for adaptation? So these are instruments that we are developing, as well as private sector, as already mentioned. We have the African Financial Alliance on Climate Change to bring on the table the key players, the key providers of finance, private sector, financial industry, in order for them to play their role, but also to green their portfolios in order to contribute to climate action. So for us, these are the next steps, having more and more private finance, help Africa access more and more climate finance, and help them also at the policy level in order to get the right long-term strategies in place, but also to enhance their ambition under the NDCs, the revised NDCs. Thank you.
Well, thank you both very much. Thank you, Danny. Thank you, Alhamdu. We're now going to go to a technical panel, but thank you for being with us. And I hope that you'll also listen in or join some of the other joint MDB events in the coming days. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
So if we can start now the technical presentation. So thank you everybody for staying with us online. We're now going to move to a technical part of the presentation where we're going to give you a progress report on what the MDBs have been doing since the last COP. And I'm very delighted that we will be joined by a number of the technical experts from different MDBs to present a deep dive into some of the topics. But if we can just start by looking at the overall situation in terms of where we've come from on Paris alignment and where we're going to. So next slide, please. So some major highlights since the last COP. we've been working on our methodologies. We've been delivering on climate finance. Of course, there's always more we can do there. And we have been also, as we heard just now from Alhamdu, been working extensively on the pandemic solutions as well. So where have we got to now? Well, we are now going to show you today a few of the more specific deep dives into some of the technical aspects. Next slide, please. This is where we're going from the COP26. We think it's important to show that we are working very, very clearly towards country-owned, ambitious climate action on ratcheting up of NDCs. We're supporting SDGs, long-term strategies, national adaptation plans. We're moving from the concept of Paris alignment into practice, with actually now showcasing and publishing on this webpage today for the event some of our methodologies. They're still working documents, but we're very happy if you want to have a look at them. And as we go forward into the next year, we will be continuing with our work and obviously improving them over time. And also, I think importantly, individual MDBs will put them into practice in their own mandates and their own organizations, and maybe they will find that they need to adjust them, and this is going to be very important as well. Next slide, please. So we're going to give you a bit of an update on where we've come from. We're going to tell you a little bit some of the lessons we've learned, and we're going to look a little bit towards the future where we're going. Next slide, please. So for those of you that don't recognize this beautiful diagram, this is the 6 building blocks of the MDB's Joint Paris Alignment Framework, launched in Katowice. And I'm going to very, very briefly run you through them all. Why did we come up with these 6 building blocks? Well, immediately after the Paris Agreement was agreed, the MDBs got together, the climate teams of the MDBs, and they looked at Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement and said, okay, finance flows, what does that mean? When you're an MDB, what does that mean? And we talked about all different kinds of finance flows, and we came up with this system to really look at every aspect of what we might be working on. Although it's important to say that depending on the MDBs, some may prioritize one or other of them more than others and work at different pace on the different building blocks. We already heard just now African Development Bank explaining their really serious focus on building block 2. So building block 1 is about aligning with the temperature goals and the mitigation goals. It's about new operations and how they should be aligned, but it's also about looking at our portfolios, identifying transition risk, managing transition risk in the portfolio. Building block 2 is the same, but from the adaptation and resilience goals. So it's really about making sure that all of our new operations do build climate resilience, whether they're public or private operations, and also looking at the physical climate change risks in our portfolios. And it's important to highlight that when we look at our existing projects and we identify risks, these are risks for our existing clients. And so there's a question there, a very important question about how can we best support countries and other clients dealing with these climate risks. And I'll come back to that in building block 4. Now, the MDBs for a long time wondered whether they should make building block 1 and building block 2 combined, because clearly every operation has to make sure that it's resilient, but also not be incompatible with the temperature goals. We did think about combining them into one giant building block. It was felt that it was better to keep them separate because they are quite different, and because we wanted to make sure that there was this very clear focus on climate resilient operations. Now, building block 3 is an area the MDBs have worked on for many years. It is about accelerating the transition through climate finance. So it's about really focusing on the part of the finance that we deliver that is making a substantial contribution to the mitigation or adaptation goals. So it's really about having robust definitions for climate finance, helping our clients implement climate projects so that we can finance more of them, mobilizing private finance for those climate projects, and just generally providing all the support we can to make sure that more climate finance is flowing. Building block 4, very important, and of course that was mentioned by both Danny and Alhamdu earlier. This is about strategic engagement with our clients, policy engagement, and helping our clients with their long-term plans, whether they are public or private clients, whether they're countries or corporates. And I think all of us would agree that this is an incredibly important part of Paris alignment. And in fact, when we think about our existing clients in our portfolio, you know, this is then links to building block 4. So we have new clients and existing clients, countries, corporates, banks, cities, regions, all of them we want to support with our building block 4 work. Building block 5 is about transparent reporting related to Paris alignment. So it's about reporting what we're doing on operations, but it's also about, for example, talking about and reporting transparently on our climate impact, on our governance and so on. And that is a very important work stream we're working on together. Lastly, I think you could call building block 6 walk the talk, or put your own house in order, whatever you want to call it. It's about really looking at what we do internally, our buildings, our travel, our treasury, etc. And there's a separate working group very actively thinking about how can the MDBs work on joint methodologies for building block 6. Next slide, please. So we've worked for a number of years on how we can look at direct operations. And I'm pleased to say that on the site today for this event, you can see our working document on building block 1 and building block 2 methodology for direct operations. I'm not going to go into all the details because I think the best thing is that you take the time when this event is finished to have a look at the documents, have a look at the methodology that's being piloted already all during this year in the MDBs, and you know, give us feedback if you want to as well. What we're going to do, next slide please, is show you a little bit about what it means for the direct financing, and then I'm going to hand to a colleague who's going to tell you, you can see the third red circle there on intermediated finance. This is very much the new work that we're doing. We're thinking now about how best to roll out a methodology for finance that's intermediated, and we will be handing over to a colleague to give you a bit of a deep dive into that, because indeed that's our latest work. Next slide, please. So very simply, the building block 1 assessment framework is indeed a questioning framework for all new operations, focusing in where the emissions really need to have a more in-depth analysis. Again, you can see these graphics in our documents. They're much easier to read in the document, but it's a questioning framework that looks at country plans, looks at emissions, looks at compatibility with sector strategies, etc. Next slide. It also has lists in this working document of universally aligned and non-aligned projects. And I think that's an important thing that helps us determine where we need to focus our efforts. So when you look at the universally aligned list, it clearly means that there's a much lower risk there of any major transition risk and incompatibility with the temperature goal. When you see the universally non-aligned list, clearly we're identifying that those activities we believe are not aligned with the temperature goal. Next slide, please. There is a methodology online, and I encourage you to have a look at that. It looks about several things which are really important in terms of, for example, is the project compatible with the NDC and the long-term strategy? What we're going to be doing is exchanging experience on this as we go forward, looking at how this is working in practice within the MDBs and seeing how to improve it. Next slide, please. For adaptation, again, a questioning framework with 3 steps, actually very similar to the 3 steps in the adaptation finance tracking methodology that we've been using for 10 years. That was obviously a logical development. We don't want to create a wholly different process-based approach. And so the adaptation teams and the MDBs have developed this questioning framework for adaptation and climate resilience, which is very similar to the adaptation finance tracking questions that we ask. Next slide, please. When we look at climate resilience, we can see that it's really important to look at have not only the assets but also the systems and the stakeholders around the project been looked at to see what are the physical climate change risks and vulnerabilities. Have measures been identified that address those risks and vulnerabilities? And is it consistent with the adaptation policies and strategies that are in place? Next slide, please. So now I'm going to hand over to my colleague Francisco Avendo in IFC, who's joining us virtually. I hope that we have Francisco online. There he is, fantastic. So over to you to present this new work that we've got now on intermediated financing.
Thank you, Nancy. Can you hear me well? Very good. Well, when it comes to the Paris alignment of financial intermediaries, we need to realize that a fraction of multilateral banks' finance comes from financial intermediaries' investments. So, and not every financial institution that is making business with, doing business with MDBs is at the same stage. So we have from very small non-banking financial institutions specialized, let's say, in microfinance in sub-Saharan Africa. And in the other side of the spectrum, we have large multinational banks that have subsidiary operations in emerging economies. So, and depending on where they are, they may have different capabilities. So in a nutshell, the Paris alignment approach is about making sure that MDB financial flows through financial intermediaries is not undermining the mitigation and adaptation or climate resilient goals of the Paris Agreement. And we do that by combining different approaches. For example, we borrow much of the criteria that is being applied to real sector or direct investments for Paris alignment. At the same time, we also look at how the MDB financial flows are happening. In most cases, we may have a ring fence type of flow in which the MDB funds are going only into specific transactions. Then we can look at those specific transactions to see exactly how they are consistent with the Paris goals. But in other times, the MD financial flow may go into the broader application within the financial institution. And in that case, we need to work on a credible pathway so that the partner financial institution may transform over time into a more aligned practice. So this comes of course, supported by different activities, including the work of multilateral development banks with regulators, also with the availability of joint resources and joint tools, for example, LTS, that can help to shape really what is the operational context of financial intermediaries. Next one, please. So in summary, we need to look at how the MDB financial flows related information can be used for defining or determining that we have alignment of the flows. Much of this will depend on the support that MDBs could provide to the financial intermediary, so they can develop capacities, they can prepare their systems and move into being Paris aligned. Of course, the expectations have to be consistent with the amount of support and the amount of resources that are channeled through the MDBs, also with the readiness stage and what capabilities does the financial institution have. And at the same time, as I said before, it is very important for MDBs to engage with financial regulators. So there is a level playground for all the financial institutions in a country. And therefore, when MDBs come to provide finance to a financial institution, there is a consistent approach, not only in that financial institution, but to the extent possible to other peers in the system. Next one, please. So we have two basic options or two basic approaches for what we call Paris alignment of intermediate finance. One is to focus on the financial institution, to look at where they are, what is their strategy, what's the level of readiness, what capabilities do they have, what's the market context, and what is their exposure as well. We may have financial institutions that are highly specialized, let's say, on financing agribusiness. Typically, agribusiness may have more exposure to climate risk. So therefore, the pathway for them will have to take into account those particularities to make sure that the milestones and the targets that they put within this pathway are consistent with their context and capabilities, and of course with the regulation context. The second option is to look at the specific funds that are being channeled through the financial institution, and then have a very granular assessment of those specific funds to see how each of them align with the mitigation and adaptation and resilient goals of the Paris Agreement. So that means applying for mitigation goals the criterion that has been mentioned by Nancy for direct investments. For example, no call power, and looking at how the financial institution could include some practices that improve how they assess sub-projects, so to have more information on each sub-project or sub-loan. And then when it comes to alignment with the adaptation goals, in the case of a specific use of proceeds, make sure that those proceeds are used in a way that climate risk is properly considered. And this doesn't happen necessarily overnight, especially for those very small microfinance institutions that may be providing, let's say, some initial capital for farmers. So in those cases, there has to be like a learning curve in which MDB do a lot of hand-holding with the institution to make sure that they prepare their systems, prepare capabilities in their staff, and they are able to assess sub-loans or transactions in a way to provide a better management of climate risk over time. Next one, please. All in all, we need to work as a group. So we need to pool expertise. MDBs have been collaborating for a long time already, but now more than ever, it is critical for MDBs to scale up the level of joint work so we can be consistent in our approach to Paris alignment of financial institutions, coming with the right messages and being consistent. Let's say that we have one MDB working now with a given financial institution, and some years later, or in parallel, some other MDBs also work with them. That work should be consistent and without reinventing the wheel. That means that we have to share resources and we have to coordinate on how we implement the approach. If you can put back the slide, please.
Are we back online here in the studio? So, thank you very much, Francisco. Indeed, we're going to go straight now to Peter Anderson of EIB, who's going to talk about building block 3 and the important new developments in our climate finance tracking. Peter.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay, Nancy?
We can hear you well, Peter.
I can't see the slides, but I assume we're on the slide about the common principles.
We're just showing the climate finance slide, but we're going to go to the next slide, please. Now we're on the common principles.
Okay, that's it. Thank you. Thank you. So Nancy mentioned the climate finance tracking methodologies are an important element of building block 3. And that's because these methodologies direct the climate finance investments that are made by MDBs and ensures that we have a harmonized approach. So the first set of common principles were actually published back in 2015, jointly by the MDBs and IDFC in the run-up to COP21. Then in COP24 in 2018, the MDBs and IDFC announced that we would review the common principles for mitigation finance. And this because we wanted to reflect the fact that the Paris Agreement had been in place since 2015. There were technology developments, and obviously we had lessons learned from the implementation of the common principles up until that stage. So we've undertaken several years of hard technical work since then. We've engaged with stakeholders in 2020, and finally we published the updated Common Principles just a few weeks ago on the 18th of October. So, what's in the updated principles? It's essentially split into two. We have an upfront text which sets out the overarching principles. It provides a definition of mitigation and the different types of climate mitigation. It also explains the link between Paris alignment and climate finance, which is an important aspect now, and also provides general guidance that applies to all sectors. Then the second part of the document is what we call the list of eligible activities. So this is 12 different tables set out by sector, each containing different criteria or a list of different activities, but also criteria and guidance. So the new principles, or the updated principles rather, should do include some new activities that we considered were really important for the delivery of the Paris Agreement. For example, we've introduced very low carbon greenfield manufacturing as a category. This wasn't in the old principles. We've also tried to include restrictions where to avoid identifying as climate mitigation finance activities that would undermine the long-term temperature goal. So this is where we bring in the really important Paris alignment aspects around BB1, so the avoidance of lock-in in fossil fuels, not hampering development of low carbon options, and so on. The new document provides much greater granularity in the list of eligible activities. So it's a much longer document now. So we're looking at a 60-page document rather than 6 pages of the old version. So it describes in a lot more detail what the different activities and subsectors are. And I think it really importantly, it provides much more detailed guidance in the new version, and the introduction of various qualitative criteria, whereas the old version only had criteria in certain places. So this really should improve the harmonisation of climate finance tracking amongst IFIs that are using this methodology, and also helps, I think, transparency for other users of or external parties to understand what we are tracking. As part of this development, obviously, there's other methodologies being developed internationally, in particular, in parallel to the work we were doing, the EU taxonomy was being developed. So we've taken into account all of these developments. Several of the MDBs have been involved in both processes, so we've been able to link the discussions there. In terms of reporting, the MDBs are already using this new methodology, and it forms part of our Paris alignment reporting, and further aspects of that are being considered under Building Block 5. And just to conclude on this, just as a next step, the MDBs and IDFC have committed to take stock in 2 years' time so that we can review any specific implementation issues, and also to take a closer look at some of the transition activities across different sectors to ensure that we have consistency in approaches. And with that, I'll hand back to you, Nancy. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Peter. That was very clear, and that was a great announcement from the MDBs and IDFC in October at the Finance in Common Summit. I'm now going to hand straight over to Kate Hughes from Asian Development Bank, who's going to talk us through some of the important work on Building Block 4.
Thanks, Nancy. Next slide, please. So Building Block 4 focuses on strategy, engagement and policy development, as Nancy explained. And it's one of the key aspects to underpin our Paris alignment approach to take our support upstream and help countries to develop robust policy frameworks. As MDBs, we provide support to countries, subnational entities and non-state actors in all areas of planning and policy development. And despite the COVID-19 pandemic, in 2020, collectively the MDBs did expand their support on all aspects of policy, including support for NDCs, for LTSs, and just transition. In total, we've supported over 96 countries along the NDC and LTS cycle with various scopes of support. This includes 69 MDB engagements in 39 countries to help develop LTS, which is more than double the number that we did in 2019. We've also stepped up our engagement on just transition with over 15 engagements during 2020 at regional and country level, covering a variety of sectors. Next slide, please. One of the key areas that the MDBs have been working on together, increasing the level of financing and coordination, is for long-term strategies at the national, subnational and sector level, including exploring the potential establishment of a joint MDB LTS facility. As a group, we recognise the critical role of LTS both for countries but also to underpin our Paris alignment efforts. And many countries are working on preparing and submitting their LTS, and I know there's been a number of countries that have submitted them this week. But there's still a huge need for support that the MDBs can offer. For example, embedding LTS in national and subnational development planning, helping countries to start using LTS as a roadmap for investments and engaging the private sector, and starting the critical process of linking LTS to NDC updates as well as other key national planning for SDGs, national adaptation plans. As countries develop their understanding of the role of LTS, we expect the demand for MDB support to grow. Next slide, please. This year, the MDBs have developed shared high-level principles to guide each institution in its support to countries in developing robust, inclusive and ambitious LTS. This set of principles is a joint high-level set, but each MDB will apply it to its own operations in a way that suits its particular client countries and operations. It's a set of 8 principles that cover various aspects of LTS, including visioning, socio-economic impacts and links to SDGs and just transition, the importance of including resilience and long-term resilience in LTS, the importance of country ownership, stakeholder engagement in the process of developing LTS, and support for developing institutional capacity for monitoring and implementation. We'll continue to work on LTS as a key area of BB4 and the Paris Alignment Framework. Thank you. So I'll stop there and hand to my colleague Isabel to talk about just transition.
Thank you very much. And I'm delighted to participate in this event. Maybe a few more words about the common work we've been doing on just transition. And I think the starting point probably dates back to the climate conference in New York in 2019, where MDBs issued a statement saying that we were going to help countries move away from fossil fuels, and by COP26 come with ambitious financing strategies that would include people at the center of this move away from fossil fuels. So during 2020 and 2021, we've been working together, and we soon realized that one of the areas that require a bit more common understanding was the proper definition of what a just transition means, because there are many different concepts that are floating around. And in order to be impactful, to be clear with our clients, and to be able to work together, we think we need to have a common understanding of what a just transition means. And these are the 5 principles that you can see on the slide at the moment. The first principle is really about the aims, delivering climate objectives and enabling the socio-economic outcomes. The principle 2, I think, would be about the tools. We will support the move away from carbon-intensive economic activities through financing, but also through policy engagement, technical advice, and knowledge sharing. The principle 3 is really about building and increasing the tools that we already have to help our countries and clients be more sustainable. Principle 4 is about the intention or the focus to mitigate the negative social economic impacts and increase opportunities associated with the transition. So to tackle the challenge, but also the opportunities that come with the green economy transition. And finally, the process. The process is about involving stakeholders who will be affected by the just transition, and having a transparent and inclusive process that involves them all. These principles set out the agenda, and Kate was saying a minute ago that we have developed already a wide range of activities where we are tackling those principles in our common or individual activities. Some examples would include reconversion of assets, for example, repurposing of fossil fuel assets into renewables or something else. We promote positive action for the affected communities, including the upskilling and the reskilling and support to workers at risk of being made redundant. We help companies and regions and countries go through the closure of assets in advance, taking care of the social, the economic, and the environmental impact that will come with it. We help communities affected by the impacts of climate change adapt their livelihoods and create economic opportunities for them. We embed gender and social considerations in green projects and economic diversification projects. And finally, we have been very active in creating some forums where we bring together the key stakeholders and try to enhance and to promote other actors speaking to each other and providing additional funding that is needed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was Isabel Blanco from EBRD talking to us about just transition. Can I have the next slide, please? So yes, we have two important aspects of building block 4, the client engagement that we've had presented by Kate and Isabel. We've got a lot of more work to do, and we will continue to work on this. I think whenever the MDBs come together and discuss Paris alignment, whatever place you start on that lovely, colourful cogwheel, you always end up, I think, coming back to building block 4 and the importance of supporting all clients, countries, public, private, small and large, because at the end of the day, it's not about us being resilient and low carbon, it's about our clients being resilient and low carbon. And so, next slide, please. We've put here a number of things that we're planning and working on. We know there's data gaps. We want to look at a particular aspect of adaptation and resilience and looking at mechanisms for making adaptation projects attractive. We need to work more, I think, on the phasing out of high-emitting technologies and how best can the MDBs do that by removing or supporting the removal of the social barriers that slow down that transition. There's a lot that we continue to do. Next slide, please. I'm going to very quickly show you a few slides on our reporting framework. We actually shared this in Madrid at COP25, and in fact, EIB has just taken over the reporting group after many years of great work from EBRD. We're kicking off this work really discussing now what would be the important aspects of reporting in terms of the purpose of reporting on Paris alignment, some key principles and approaches, and what would be the joint principles, for such reporting. Next slide, please. Some of the issues we've thought about already are that we have to think about the different building blocks, what would be important to report. I think the issue of risk and the issue of impacts are clearly going to come to the fore. One of the other things I think we hear a lot about net zero alliances here at Glasgow. The MDBs obviously are doing a lot of work on new operations, but increasingly we are talking together about portfolios, including some of the MDBs have become reporting members of TCFD. So there's a lot of work going on, I think, on the portfolio angle as well. But we will come back to you probably in 2022 with some more thinking about building block 5. Next slide, please. Of course, we already have some fantastic reporting that we're already doing. So here are two reports that you may know well. One is already the MDBs have produced joint reports about private finance mobilization for sustainable infrastructure and climate, and of course our flagship joint climate finance report this is the cover of the one from 2020, and you can look out for the 2021, hopefully around May, June next year. And now I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Gareth Phillips from African Development Bank, who's going to tell us a bit about the work we're doing on Building Block 6.
Thank you very much indeed, Nancy, and it's a pleasure to be here. So if I could have the next slide, please. Nancy really captured it when she said that BB6 is about walking the talk. This is about putting our money where our mouth is and demonstrating that we're serious about doing these activities. And there are two clear aspects that we need to focus on. One is the direct or the internal sources of emissions. So these are activities where we make decisions that directly impact upon greenhouse gas emissions. And then there are external activities, or where we make decisions that act upon or create actions that happen outside the scope of our offices and buildings and so on, where we incur or create other sources of greenhouse gas emissions. So we undertook a stock-taking exercise amongst the MDBs, and we identified 6 key areas where we need to do further work. Next slide, please. So the 6 key areas that we're focusing on cover buildings, mobility, procurement, treasury, pension and governance. And I'll skip now to a couple of slides forward and just talk about some of the best practices. One more slide, that's it, thank you. We'll just talk briefly about some of the best practices that we've seen amongst the MDBs. So first of all, on buildings, we have, for example, a certification of some buildings, the LEED standards and ISO 14001 and so on, which encourage us to look at the greenhouse gas emission footprint from the operation of our buildings. And do things like energy efficiency standards, managing energy consumption and putting in new technologies that help us reduce emissions from buildings. And indeed, if we are building new buildings, then that becomes a critical area to look for best practice. On mobility, interestingly, as we kicked this off, we were involved in a lot of travel, both for international meetings and traveling to and from work. But actually, COVID-19 has possibly one of the few upsides of COVID-19 has shown us that we can do a lot more work with video conferencing and teleworking, working from home and so on. And so I think we've made good progress towards addressing our greenhouse gas emissions associated with our travel. And perhaps as we come out of COVID-19, we need to make sure that we maintain those standards and don't slip backwards. So that will be very interesting to see how that area develops. On procurement, of course, we procure a lot of goods and services, not only for the construction of our projects, but also for the operations of our buildings and activities and meetings and so on, catering, things like that. And here we need to look at sourcing suppliers who have Paris-aligned policies and strategies and goals to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. And I think this will be very interesting. We may see the development of certification standards for service providers that give us comfort and confidence that they are acting in ways that are reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Pensions and treasury are also very interesting, not things that we're particularly aware of necessarily, but on our pensions, definitely amongst the MDBs, we have quite substantial pension funds, and it's very important that we walk the talk by demonstrating and ensuring that these funds are not invested in assets that are creating greenhouse gas emissions. So there's I think work to be done there in coming up with pensions and encouraging pension funds to offer resources and funds that are Paris aligned and going in that direction. And our treasury funds, these are funds that we hold in trust. When donors give us funds to then invest on projects, we hold on to those until they're spent, and we need to make sure that they are invested in the right place. And finally, on governance, we're all working on coming up with policies and strategies, and at the African Development Bank just last week we approved our own greenhouse gas policy and strategy, which is committing us to Paris alignment by 2025. I'll hand back to Nancy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gareth. Next slide, please. This is a timeline showing you how we're all working towards Paris alignment. Each MDB obviously comes up with its own timeline, but this gives you a general idea of where we're going as a group. EIB, of course, actually already committed for 2021 to have all its financing activities Paris aligned. Many of the other MDBs have strategically committed to dates, and we're all supporting one another in this enterprise, noting that MDBs have their own mandates and have to set their own dates. Next slide, please. So very quickly, there's a lot going on, as you heard. Frankly, we could have sat here for another 6 hours probably and told you a lot about what we've been working on. We've picked out a few things. You can look at the documents online for this event page. I've put here a few things that are really important for us going forward, and we did hear from both Danny and Alhamdi what they thought were the key next steps for the MDBs. Next slide, please. In the meantime, please do join us at the same time in events in this joint pavilion in the coming days, where there'll be more in-depth analysis of joint MDB work on particular topics. And now I'd like us to close out this event. I'm delighted that we have with us Mark Bowman, Vice President of EBRD. Mark, would you like to give us your thoughts on at the end of this Paris alignment progress update?
Well, thank you very much, Nancy, for this opportunity to say a few closing words. And I know we're a bit short of time, so I'll try and be very brief. But I really want to thank colleagues today for all their presentations, and really just to say that the MDB common approach to aligning our activities and operations with the objectives of the Paris Agreement, obviously incredibly important, and obvious from the discussions today that our decision to work together on this has been absolutely right to respond to the demands of our shareholders, but also absolutely right in terms of the needs of our countries and the clients that we work with. Of course, also along the way, we've worked very much with partners outside the MDB system, and that's been extremely important, and will continue. As we've heard today, we've had some great presentations today. We've heard that we've made an enormous amount of progress developing the MDB approach to Paris alignment. We've heard about the journey since Paris, when the MDBs first announced their intention to align with Paris, the development of the 6 building blocks, and the great work that has gone on, the technical work that has taken place to develop guidance, methodologies, best practices, and to pilot the new approaches. And it's been absolutely fantastic to listen to all of this and to have this opportunity to showcase the progress that has been made. What I really want to do is just to end with 2 points. First of all, to kind of thank all of the teams for their excellent collaboration. I think that's been a very kind of strong theme that's come out of the discussions today, the extent to which the experts across all the MDBs have worked together to develop these methodologies, the kind of excellent collaboration and joint working. But also to say that the technical work has been extremely important, but this is more than just, we have to appreciate that this is more than just a technical exercise. Paris alignment is not just a compliance function, it's not just a kind of compliance activity. Paris alignment is a real game changer in terms of all of our activities, and it's a new organising principle for everything that we do, and it's the opportunity for the MDBs to make their contribution to achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement. So on that note, thank you very much to all of our participants. Thank you very much for everyone for attending today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. That's very, very good to hear that message from a Vice President of one of the MDBs. Thank you to all of you online who've joined this today. If you're watching this as a recording on YouTube, please do share it. Please have a look at the page where the documents are, and thank you for joining us today. Goodbye.